So we're being immortalized now. Good. So anyway, Jacob, again, thanks for your talk. I think you hit it on the head. You know, what's important is the behind meaning, because just any kind of religion, any sort of spiritual practice that you can take up is just sort of a fundamental human undertaking. You know, we all come into this life not knowing what's going on, and we try to figure it out. And I think we try to figure it out with some varying degree of rigidity and certainness. And the sad fact is, or maybe not sad, maybe the liberating fact is that there is no certainty that we can hang on to, but we create a lot of trouble for ourselves and other people by thinking that there may well be. I was going to say, if you're interested in, if you're interested in sort of Christian antecedents that resemble Zen, there's a really great book by Thomas Merton called The Wisdom of the Desert. I think I've got a copy of it if you want to borrow it, but it's all about the desert fathers who fled civilization for caves in the desert to purify their practice. And so many of those stories have such a, what we'd call a Zen essence to them. So yeah, you might look that up. So thanks again for your talk. And does anybody have any questions?
Yes, I do. Dennis.
Yes.
How are you?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, that's what Zen Master Sung San always used to say to people. He was famous for it. How are you? You know, you ask that question by a Zen master, you got to be careful. And actually, Zen Master He Kwang and I, years and years ago, edited the first version of the 10 Gates Konan book. And in the process of doing that, I wrote a letter to Aitken Roshi, who was a good friend of Daesan Saneem's. And he wrote and asked him if he'd write a little foreword to it. And he was very graciously sent back a few pages. And that's what he dealt with, was this "how are you" question. You know, and he said, you know, that's like the stalest American greeting you can imagine. You know, how are you? Oh, fine, I'm good. Fine, how are you? Yeah, and then you get on to the meat of whatever it is you're going to deal with. But, you know, nobody really considers that question in and of itself. And he, in his writing about it, Aitken Roshi sort of connected it to Kongan practice. You know, and really this is a Kongan. How are you? And right now, this moment, and how that in Kongan practice, almost all of us undertake what he called temporizing. You know, we're always trying to run our little game somehow to keep something at bay, maybe just facing ourselves, facing this moment, facing the teacher in front of us, facing the question that we're asked. And we all have these sort of mechanisms that we create and try to maintain, you know, more or less successfully through our lives. The problem is that always gets knocked down. Eventually, we always lose that. Ultimately, we die. We lose everything. And, you know, coming face to face with the fact that there is nothing that we can hold on to, that even though we consider it so precious to ourselves, that's something to come to terms with sooner rather than later. You know, there's so many stories of people on their deathbeds regretting this and that and wishing they'd done this and that. And it's something that the behind meaning of everything that Jacob mentioned is pointing to all the time. And we do our utmost to avoid that. You know, we really don't want to look at that. So I went and saw my doctor several months ago, and, you know, they ran these tests on me and did all this stuff. And as I was, you know, staying there at the front office or the desk, just sort of trying to get out of the office, one of the people there handed me this pamphlet, and it said, and she just said, "Here." And I looked at it, and it's final directives. So, you know, it wasn't like, well, here's something you might be interested in, or, well, here's something you might want to look into to plan, or you better do something about this today. I mean, there was nothing, there was no context. It was just here. And So I thought, oh, well, okay, and I took it home and I thought about it. Well, of course, yeah, that is something I want to think about, well, I've got time to think about it. How do I want to exit this world? And what sort of, what, yeah, basically just how. And if I could, if I get the choice, how would I do it? And that led me to think about people I've known. Well, the first thing it led me to think about was a book by Ram Dass. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's Richard Alpert, who was a Confederate of Timothy Leary's back in the old LSD days, who became Ram Dass, went to India and found a teacher and got some sort of awakening, came back and taught here in the States. He died last year, I guess. But he wrote a wonderful little book called How Can I Help? And I haven't seen it for years. I wish I still had a copy of it. It's really just a small, slender little volume. And basically it's a manual for caregivers. So how do you take care of people, particularly people who are ill or dying? And how do you take care of yourself in that context? It's really a wonderful book. If you can find it, I'd really recommend it. But one story he told in there really struck me. So one of the caregivers that he was writing about, that he had known or interviewed or talked to, said that she was taking care of a woman who was terminally ill with cancer. She was in hospice and in terrible pain, really intractable pain. And they, no matter what they did for her, they couldn't really, the palliative care just wasn't enough. And so the story this woman told was that one night, this woman was lying in her bed, writhing in pain and just unable to escape it, and began suddenly having these memories of past lives. And they became faster and faster and faster and faster and just shot through her mind. And in every instance, what she was remembering was how she died, in these past lives. And the upshot of the story was that after a certain time of experiencing that, she suddenly realized that her pain is the pain, which I thought was just a wonderful way of expressing the sort of bodhisattva ideal. So she came to this realization at that, in that terminal point in her life, and was able to, she told this caregiver about it, who then told Ram Dass about it, who then wrote about it and made that available to the wider world, through this book. So that's the opportunity that we've all got all the time. We don't have to wait until we're lying on our deathbed to do that. There was another woman that Zen Master He Kwang and I knew years and years ago from Topeka. Her name was Betty, and I can't even remember her surname. She used to practice with us, and sometimes we'd go over there and practice with her in Topeka. This was really early on in the days of the Zen Center, and she became ill with cancer and terminally ill and died pretty rapidly. And before she died, she asked if I would give a eulogy or a speech at her funeral, which I agreed to. And so I, went to the funeral and gave this little short speech. And what really struck me though was afterwards, the funeral director came up and took me aside and he said, I've been doing this, as you can imagine, for a long time. I've dealt with any number of people who are dying. And he said, I have to tell you that I have not met another person who had so much concern and care for the people around her as she was going through this process of dying herself. And I've never forgotten that, So Zen Master Sung Sung always says, good karma, bad karma, doesn't matter. How do you use your karma? So our direction in that, and I think, Jacob, the behind meaning in all religion is not for me. How do you use that? Not for me. So dying is not bad karma. Dying just means that at some point you were born. that's all it is, So, but knowing that's approaching, knowing the inevitability of that, what can you do? What can you do? So that's the sort of fundamental koan for all of us. And, Zen practice, I guess the behind meaning of what we call Zen practice is an attempt, not a solution, but an attempt to grapple with that and live in the moment as much as possible, not for me. Yeah, and maybe not so much suffering appears in the world. Maybe not so much suffering appears in you. So thanks for asking how I am.
Thank you for your answer.
I really don't know how I am. Are there any other questions?
I have a question, Rusty. Hello, Dennis.
Yes.
Let me give just a brief backstory. I went walking in the East Lawrence Cemetery the other day after I heard Stan. There's a beautiful walk and to do walking meditation there. It's right by the Zen Center. And I kind of parked my car anywhere and I just started walking. And about 5 minutes in, I ran into a giant 6x6 headstone with my last name on it. And I thought, what an interesting experience. What a coincidence. And since I've been practicing more, I find that more of these kind of magical coincidences in my life where and maybe you'd say it's not a big deal. You run into your last name and there's lots of last names, but I looked at the headstone and I did some examination, and there was a woman that had lived 100 years and she had these 3 children and they all died before 15 years old. And it was just this really powerful experience. I was like, wow, she lived 100 years and she only had these kids for a short time. But I just wondered, what that means. Is it this idea that we practice so that, what you said earlier, that it makes us more present, and so that we're open to those experiences, and I just wonder what the practice says about it.
I'm not sure that it's so much about the practice, to tell you the truth, as about your state of mind or your own openness to those kinds of experiences and what they might mean to you. When you said that, when you told me that what had happened with the monument, my first thought was, oh, that's Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. The ghost of Christmas future, Christmas yet to come, which is a really pretty damn moving moment, in that whole story. Looking at his own gravestone, realizing, I'm gone. I'm going to be gone. I've also walked in that cemetery, and I had a similar experience in terms of just looking at the dates on those tombstones and thinking, these people were as alive as I am now. These people's lives were as vivid as mine feels to me. These people, and I know nothing about them. I know nothing about them other than maybe this name, these dates on this marker, maybe a little bit of information about them or their family or something. And that is quite a humbling experience, because certainly we're all more or less fixated upon ourselves. We're fixated upon how we're doing, and a lot of times how the world's perceiving us, what we're putting out, how it's being received, how it's, what sort of feedback we get, how am I doing, is so often based upon, that sort of thing. That's no problem with that. That's inevitable. We're social beings. But at some point, and maybe in this situation like you've described, looking at that, we get this realization that that is all a construct. That is all something we made up. And if I don't have that, what am I? And that really leads you to some fundamental reckoning, I think. Not that you're going to particularly find an answer, but I think that question is vitally important. If you want to live your life without, well, maybe deathbed regrets. I'm not sure yet. I'll let you know. But there's any number of things in our lives that lead us to that, and really, moment to moment, everything is leading us to that. We just don't have the wit to see it. We don't have the inclination to see it. We don't have the fearlessness to see it, I think, because so much of what we do is based on fear, and so much of what we do is based on trying desperately to scabble some sort of security together that's going to allay that fear, but we never look at the cause of it, So I think walking around in cemeteries is quite a useful thing to do. You know, it really does sort of knock the pins out of underneath a lot of that really fundamentally exhausting enterprise that we're all engaged in. It is so tiresome, you know, at a certain point, to just try to maintain that, even at the same time that it is such a fearful thing to think that we're going to lose it. So somewhere in there, somewhere through that, you know, that sort of winding path, that maze that we all seem to be walking through here, I think there's a way of reckoning with that. I think it's imperative that we do that, reckon with that. And again, I think I know I say this every talk. It's not because we're going to feel better, although that might be a side effect. You know, that could well be a side effect. You might be happier because you undertake this. Maybe not, I don't know. But there it is possible. I've seen it in people. It is possible to live in a way that allays the suffering around us. Sometimes you just meet a person, maybe you just brush by them on the street and suddenly there's this sort of moment, you know, and something in us, I don't know, it's not an easy thing to describe, but sometimes you just meet someone or you're in some situation which just for a moment gives you a little bit of an opening, just allows that tension in us to relax. And suddenly it's like, oh, yeah, it's such a relief, you know, that happens. And it's also very familiar. It's like a recognition of who you really are, you know, without all of that obfuscation that's constantly going on, you know. So I think practice is important because it's an organized technique. It's an organized method for trying, you know, for pointing us at that before meaning to begin with and allowing us to access it within ourselves, because that's where it is. It's nothing out there. It's not the gravestone that you saw that, you know, created anything in you. That's you. That's yours. And what I've found over the years is I just haven't encountered any other technique or method that seems as efficacious as the way Zen Master Sun San brought this practice and taught it to us, and the way we're trying to propagate it. It just cuts away so many frills. You know, there's just not much there other than pointing always, 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 always. Yeah, what is this? What is this? How are you? How are you? And for that, I'm deeply grateful. You know, deeply grateful that he brought it to us. Deeply grateful that there is a sangha of people, you know, worldwide that are practicing something that, in its particular iteration, was pretty much unknown, you know, before maybe 50 years ago. That to me just seems like an incredible gift, I guess, for all of us. So, you know, again, sort of referring to Jacob's talk, I'm not sure that the technique is as important as what it's pointing at, any particular technique, because I've certainly met people from other traditions. I've certainly encountered situations in other traditions where that kind of opening, that sort of recognition and that sort of connection can occur, you know. So some part of me doesn't want to get all kumbaya about it, but on the other hand, it's like we're all human beings. We're all facing the same situation. We all respond to it in a whole, almost infinite variety of ways. But it seems to be true throughout history that the point at which all of this is aiming is a common point for all of us. And I guess the only other thing I'd want to say is that point's not outside of any of us. So, you know, the fact that you responded the way you did, that's yours, you know, that's really yours. And there's the sort of support that this practice gives is allowing us to trust that. Most times we don't trust that at all. We get these moments, we get these things, and they don't make any sense oftentimes, you know, in the way we sort of tend to think of the world. And we oftentimes don't trust it, or we ignore it, or we just kind of bury it, or we don't want to think about it. But being involved in a sustained practice like this allows you, almost demands, forces you to come to trust yourself in these situations. And that also is very valuable, because that is not about trusting your ego. That is not about trusting your thinking. That's about trusting something else. Your original nature, your before thinking mind, the behind meaning has lots of names, but you know, it's there and we can all do it. So thanks, Rusty, for your question. Maybe we'll run into each other in the graveyard one of these days. I guess that's all the time there is. So I guess we'll have announcements.